I'll make it good whether or not you actively participate, but it's better if you do. So this presentation, I think, who's dealt with an angry person before? I figured. It might be at your job or not, I guess. So a lot of these skills will apply whether or not you're at work, so that's a bonus. This one focuses on more so that like you find yourself in a conversation, maybe you didn't expect it to go unpleasantly and you want to veer it back on course. I have a different one that focuses more on, you're going into a tough conversation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about things that you do during your day that help conversations go better, things that you do when you find yourself in it, and then how you make sure that after you've had that conversation, you just don't have it like every week. Has anybody ever had the same exact conversation with the same person about the same thing that they did? No, that never happens. So these are two books I highly recommend, Crucial Accountability and Crucial Conversations. They're one of the few books I've read 3 or more times, so I think they're that good. And they talk a lot about having these conversations or like having constructive ways of, I told you to do this, you need to do it. So I come from the background of art education, which means I have a tendency to randomly borrow things from other sources. So this is actually from, how to maintain like a relationship, friendship, if you want somebody to feel more feelings towards you. However, it does apply in this context, and I'll explain. So when you have a positive relationship with somebody, they tend to, I call it, give you more grace. If I assume that you have positive intention and that you're a good person, you'll probably read my email and give me a little more grace if I like misspell something or maybe use a poor choice of words. Versus, I think you're all familiar with somebody that you know that doesn't like you, and you say, "Hi, how are you today?" And they're like, "Why would you say that?" And you're like, "What?" That never happens, right? So on this list, the first 3 are the easiest. Proximity. If you come to my school district and you go to one of the days when I'm out at the high school, you'll see a table out in the commons, and I'm sitting at the table. The secretaries have tried several times to get me to go find a room to be in, and I keep refusing to do that. And the reason I do that is, like, if you come into the building, you will see that I'm there, whether or not I have a brightly colored suit. But that puts me in close proximity. And I started doing this during COVID because I was a principal at the time, and I was like, if I go and I do my rounds with the teachers and it turns out I have COVID and the whole school gets quarantined, I think I'll be burned at the stake, and I didn't like that idea. So I put a table out, and I noticed that teachers would come up and ask me questions that they would normally not be brave enough to walk a few more steps and go into my office for. And it was just because I was there, I was easy to get to. Person's walking by, I had a random question pop in my head. I'll just ask you because you're there. So I joke it was the no walls. Some people have open door policy. I had a no walls policy. Frequency, that's a lot like proximity. How often are you in contact? That's why the school kids that get on the bus that have somebody that greets them every day with a smile, they like their bus driver. They may know nothing about them besides that they drive them, but they will be very happy to see their bus driver. And like I'm kind of alluding to there, obviously I'm implying that it's either a neutral or positive relation, like interaction. And all you need to do to make it positive is like, "Hi, nice to see you." Smile does a lot. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with people that go, "Hi." That doesn't work, just to be clear. Duration. I think that's pretty obvious. The longer you are in around somebody, conversing with somebody, the more you'll have some sort of standing relationship. And the hardest one on this is intensity. So some of you may have had mentors or been a mentor, and that has more to do with what you get out of the conversation. So if somebody comes up to you and you give them that spot-on advice about how to tell the employee that they can't use their ESST that way, if they felt like that was really informative and that you were a person that could give that information, the quality of that interaction would build a positive rapport more quickly. Now, one thing that we tend to do when we do get into a situation with somebody that maybe we don't have the warm and fuzzies for is that we might avoid these things. You know, like we don't go to their classroom, we avoid talking to them. We send them an email on Friday at 4 because we're going out the door. People do notice when you do that, so just sometimes it's a very good strategy, but if it's too often, that people might notice that. And like I said, that can become a bit of a self-sabotage sometimes. And this is a reason why some companies will do things like have common break times just so that employees are interacting with each other more often and they have more opportunities. And so if your school's in a place where nobody ever has any time to say, hi, how's your day? It probably affects this within your employees, so it's just something to chew on. Diagnosing the issue. I have found this to be a pretty useful thing. Usually when two people aren't getting along, it's because of one of these 4 elements is missing. So first is safety. I'm sure you've heard people say, like, I can't talk to that person. They're going to go run around me. They're going to run to somebody. They're going to tell on me, whatever. Safety is that sense that they can talk to you and nothing bad's going to happen to them. It doesn't mean that it needs to be a rational fear, but that's what they tell themselves. Trust. Trust is more than just being able to trust what you say is honest, but also being like predictable. If you're the sort of person that kind of sticks with your opinion and people can predict where you're going to stand on something and how you feel and how you behave, that makes you more trustworthy, even if it's maybe like somebody you don't maybe particularly care for, but you at least find them predictable. That still develops a little bit of trust. Obviously, if I go to one person and tell you how much I hate Johnny, and then I go over to Johnny and tell that person how much I hate you, that does not build trust. And they will eventually talk to each other, in case you don't know that. So purpose. That's the one I hope in school districts is the easiest to do, because we should all be here for kids, right? And I know several of us are in the business office, and you might get treatment from people that act like your job doesn't involve doing what's best for kids. It does, because if they have no money in the bank or it's empty, they will find their job will be harder. So they may not want to admit that, but it's very important, and it's a part of doing what's best for kids. And so when you have a common purpose, you tend to give people more grace. So if people don't feel like you have the same purpose, that can be a trust fracture. And of course, respect. Respect is the sense that somebody values your knowledge and expertise. Who here has been put in a situation where somebody did something that made them feel like they did not value what they knew and what their expertise was? Yeah, you don't like that, right? And so I remember using these with a set of teachers that I had once. One was special ed, one was business. And their relationship devolved over time, and eventually I had to intervene as the principal because I didn't want fights breaking out in the hallway between my staff. And it started really simply. One kid needed time for intervention, and they took him out of the other teacher's class. And it was always their class, and eventually the one felt like they didn't value the time in their class, and so they felt disrespected, and then they didn't trust, and then they felt like they had different purposes. And so what I did was we scheduled weekly meetings where I helped them talk through things where, no, like you both want to help the kid. You're focused on typing and business classes, and you're focused on the stuff of the IEP. The kid needs both of them. How do we meet both needs? And I got them to the point where they could talk and be cordial. They never did like each other, so I'm not promising any rainbows and magic sunshine here, just to be clear. So one of the reasons that these things can cause issues is if you lack them, you will have a tendency to go through confirmation bias. And if you watch the news, you probably have all kinds of examples of that, I imagine. So if somebody thinks that you don't have their best intentions in mind, that you disrespect them, they'll tend to interpret your behavior as reinforcing their assumption of what's going on. So sometimes you might have to ask about like, hey, Or you might be in the position where you're watching two people interact and you can tell that, like, okay, there's something going on here. Unfortunately, we don't always ask each other what's bothering us, and sometimes we just will give other reasons. And one of the biggest things I find that can kind of tip you off that one of these things is going on is like a disproportionate reaction. So for example, one time I was working with a principal and a special ed teacher, and there was like a minor scheduling snafu where something overlapped, and the principal got really mad because they did it on purpose and blah, blah, blah. And it turned out that apparently they had them when they were a kid in school and they were a pain in the neck, and they hadn't forgotten about that. I did have to tell them, you need to let that go. They're an adult now. Okay, so my presentation on hard conversations goes more into this, but these are some signs that maybe something is awry with the conversation. So words and actions not aligning. I remember a conversation with a parent where I was talking to them about their kid, and they're like, I'm fine, everything's fine. And they were turning a literal bright shade of red. And I said, you don't look fine, and I'll get more into that later, but what they were saying and then how they were behaving wasn't lining up. Body language, if some people cross their arms naturally, but a lot of closed off language or avoiding eye contact, different things like that can kind of signal to you that somebody's bothered. I'm sure you've all gotten eye rolls, like when you say that you can't order that for whatever reason. Redirection or drilling down. I encountered this one a lot, particularly when I was a principal dealing with playground issues. But I've learned that if somebody goes either on a 20 questions of who was there, what time of day it was, what the weather was like, what did they say beforehand, usually that means they're trying to find a reason that maybe they don't trust the supervisor that was out there that said that their kids started a fight. So they're trying to find a fault in the story, and that's why they're asking so many questions. And sometimes you have to kind of stop and be like, okay, what are you really looking for here? Or the common redirection, deflection. You go up to Susie and say, your class is in complete disarray. And they say, well, have you been over to Johnny's? They're hanging from the ceiling. That might be true, but it's not relevant to your conversation in that moment. So, and a lot of times I find when people do deflection, it's usually because they feel vulnerable. They feel like they're in danger. It's usually like a safety thing. They want to direct your attention somewhere else so that they don't have to deal with the problem at the moment. All or none language is another one I found that's pretty common signal. They always do that. They never do that. Usually somebody's generalizing, and when you're frustrated, you have a tendency to go from this has happened 3 days this week to it happens every day, all night, and on weekends. That shows that something's wrong. Justifying. This one you might have to watch in yourself too. If somebody comes in and says, I have to come in yelling and screaming because that's the only way anybody will listen, nobody deals with that, right? A lot of times that means there's a fracture in the relationship, and they think they justify poor behavior because they think that's the only way that they're going to get heard. And always pay attention to your own behavior under pressure. I know I'll start tapping my foot and fidgeting, or I might start stuttering more. And what that lets you know is that your sense of safety or your sense of comfort is going south. And sometimes it's better to say, hey, time out. I got to get a drink. I got to go to the bathroom. I just got a phone call and I need to go, because you need a minute. Because sometimes you need a minute. So paying attention to your own signals is important. So stop and reflect on these questions at your table. Think of a scenario where conflict existed between two individuals. What do you think the source of the problem was, and perhaps why? And what outward behaviors did you notice that gave you that impression? And then what do you think was absent that made that conversation, that relationship contentious? About. You can only focus on you. Man or woman in the mirror, whichever works. So a lot of times when you're going into a conversation, a lot of it's happening before you get there, right? You're trying to guess what the person's thinking, you're trying to guess why they did it. And the first thing to do is make sure that you're focusing on the facts. Because sometimes, like when we get anxious, when we get upset, I'll piggyback off your example, that person that you just told needed a break is talking to you immediately, and you're thinking, well, you're not respecting my break boundary, and like you're just barreling into this, where you might be like, okay, I asked for a break and they continued. Okay, why might there be a misunderstanding? So like getting back to the facts, I did that a lot with as a principal, I dealt with a lot of playground incidents, and the first step was like, okay, what happened? No, not how you felt about it. Okay, this. Because sometimes it interferes with our own logic if we get too far down the rabbit hole if we're not sure of what the basic facts are. Own your role. A lot of times you make you mad. And so there's an interesting study, and I think it makes kind of for a funny story. And so they're telling people this different story about they went to a bank, and there was a bank robbery, and they get shot. And they had 3 types of responses. They had oh, what terrible luck, I was at the bank when it was robbed and I got shot. And they had, oh, what great luck, I'm still okay, I got shot, but I'm fine. And then, gosh, there were so much more deserving people in the room to get shot than me. There you go. So, like, how you interpret the situation can make a difference between, like, okay, I'm stuck in traffic, it sucks, nice sunset, and like road rage. And we all have bad days, so to give yourself grace as well. Know what you hope to accomplish with your conversation. I find like a lot of times we veer off when we want to win the conversation. So I've had a lot of conversations in the last year where like perhaps my sense of safety or perhaps my sense of respect was violated, and I maybe had a really good reason to be upset. But can you imagine if I went into the conversation with the person and I just wanted to rail them about all the terrible things that happened? I probably was not going to get heard, and they probably weren't going to listen to me. But sometimes we forget what we're trying to accomplish. And so it's really important when you go into a conversation, okay, I want to tell this teacher about like, okay, you can improve your discipline because there's a few things going wrong. Well, if you go in there and you tell them every single thing that you've noticed, they're going to shut down, that kind of thing. So make sure you know what you're trying to accomplish. Another good example of getting back to the facts is when I was an art teacher. I remember getting a call once, and it was from a parent, and they like launched into it. Their kid had logged into the grade book. Their kid had an F. And they're like, you don't get to decide what good art is. Art is subjective. And they were going on. And I said, wait. I forgot a 0. They have 100%. It's fine. And if that person had started with just asking me like, okay, I see this 10. Can you explain why there's a 10 here? And then I would have said, I left a 0 off. And that's all it was. But they were good and mad by the time they called me because they assumed that like they had made assumptions. Okay. So the other thing I find really important about this slide is, of course, you're the only one you can control. So what happens when you focus on other people and their behavior? Do you feel in control? Does it make you anxious? It does, and so it's very good to focus on what you can control, like the other presentation I went into, the controllables that you can manage and the things that you can make decisions on. You can't control if somebody else is going to listen to you or be rational or reasonable. You can just do what you can do. There we go. So, kind of on the same theme, your conversation with people starts long before you actually have that confrontation. And something that pays to pay attention to is there's a reason branding exists. There's a reason people get paid to tell you how to sell their product. And the reason for that is it gives you kind of an image. It gives you a kind of a way to perceive things. And your brain, going kind of back to that confirmation bias, you have something called the RAS, reticular activating system. So what you're expecting, your brain tunes in on, and what you're used to, your brain pays attention to. So like it kind of filters what information you're taking in. So if somebody uses a lot of I, they, them language, and they do that consistently over time, what does that naturally start to do? Yes, it separates you. And I worked with a board member once, and they were a good person, but they talked this way a lot. They used a lot of them, they, and that does something very different than when you say we, us, together, are. And I'll talk more about this later, but if you're visiting with a staff member and they're trying to figure out how to use their FML leave, and you're like, I'm trying to help you work through this, we'll get through it together, that's going to be interpreted a lot different than like, why didn't you get this in on time? Why didn't you read through this? Why didn't you? Because they're going to latch on to the you, where if you start saying our, together, us, those choices, especially over time, and like I said, you'll get yourself some grace with positive relationships. So like, not every single time you talk like that you need to worry, but it does make a difference. And here's another good example. Who's here has ever gotten the dreaded text or email from their supervisor that says, I want to visit at the end of the day, no explanation? So be mindful of what your communication is maybe putting the other person through. They're used to, if they get a message like that, something's wrong. And I got a good story about that. I once called a parent when I was an art teacher, and I asked them if they had been getting the letters I had sent because this student had been doing really good in class. And they said no, they hadn't ever gotten a letter. And so I went to the student and I said, hey, like, what's going on here? I found out the student who struggled in other classes had been going to the mailbox and getting the letters out because she assumed that they were bad because they were from the school. Yeah, right? I was like, no, I was saying like how good an art student they were. And she had such bad experiences that seeing a letter from the school caused her anxiety, so she actually asked me to stop doing it. So it kind of tells you a lot, I think, too, about like what that can do, because she was expecting something bad, and so she didn't even take a look at what it was. So, another stop and reflect. Can you identify a situation in which you got worked up due to a story you told yourself? You got that text and you're like, what did I do in the last week? What could I have possibly done wrong? Am I getting fired? That kind of stuff. What word choices may identify what message your word choices may have communicated. How did the story you told yourself affect how you chose to pick your words? And what behaviors did you have that indicated how you were feeling? Pause. But kind of the biggest thing I want you to take away from this conversation that I'm having is that when you talk to somebody, you really want to have a shared meaning, and you want them to understand that you have a shared purpose. And I'll go more into those strategies, but for this one I'll focus on having a shared purpose. Like when you're having that conversation, I find it's useful to keep emphasizing, hey, we're trying to solve this problem, we're trying to work through this together. I see that you're upset, I want to help you through it. If you keep circling back to that, that goes back to that like trust and purpose. like that purpose you can kind of build in the conversation. A lot of the other stuff you have to build ahead of time. And like a lot of times when people get upset is that they have a problem and they want to feel like they're doing something about it. And in the absence of a solution, yelling at you is doing something. You want to replace that with we're trying to work on it together. Then being mad at you is not very constructive to what they're trying to do. And so, like, something to keep in mind. Emphasizing you're a team is always very important, same reason. Okay. And so these kind of go hand in hand, which is why I put them across from each other. And I'm sure you've all heard it's not about you. And that can be hard in the moment to feel like the situation is not about you, because they might be using words about like you didn't do this or you didn't do that. But a lot of times, a lot of these things come from feelings of inadequacy. Like I said, they want to do something or inaccurate assumptions. I remember in one of the places I work, I would periodically get a phone call from a particular parent and they'd be upset about something. And I'd take the time to get to know like what they were dealing with, and I eventually learned that they were a single parent, and I lived in a small town, and they liked to gossip about what they were out doing the night before, which I always told her was none of my business, I don't care. But she would get the feeling that people thought she was a bad parent, and so part of the reason that she came in barreling mad was that she wanted to prove, no, I'm working hard, I'm doing things, and like, when I would use language like, I see that you're working hard. I see that you have a difficult schedule. That like, it quickly brought her down so we could have a more rational conversation. Versus some people that she'd interact with would engage in the argument, and I'm sure you guys can imagine that that went wonderfully, and I didn't have to talk to them later about it. So one of the funnier stories I have about this is I once had a grandma come in because she was concerned about her child or her grandchild, and it got started off because her kid was telling her, this was a kindergarten student, so keep in mind the stories kindergartners tell you, but they were telling grandma that the other classmates were flashing their child. And it really stemmed from there was a bathroom at the front of the classroom, and sometimes somebody would peek out and ask for help. And I think the child kind of exaggerated certain details because it was more exciting that way. But when the parent came in, they were initially grandparent came in, they were initially very upset. And I had to use a lot of these, we're trying to solve the problem, we're on the same team, we want the same thing. And eventually I got her to open up that the reason that she was so worked up was that she worked 2 shifts. The mom had a mobility problem. If she didn't make sure the kid got to school, she didn't get to school. And she could see that they weren't making progress. And then this happened. And it actually ended with first verifying that I looked into it and no, your kid's not being flashed. So let's make sure we understand that. And then we actually made an exception to like our after school program rules so that the kid could get extra help in math and reading, because that's grandma was working 2 shifts and she couldn't help, and you know, for whatever reason mom wasn't dependable for that task. And after that we got along quite a bit better. And even though it started off on kind of a bad foot, we did get to a good one. And I'll revisit, oh wait, this is the next slide. So here's some tools to get people talking, because people do various things. Sometimes they shut down, they don't think you're going to listen, so they quit talking, or they get very upset and agitated, like I said. And so mirroring is my first technique. Your brains have mirror neurons, and so you naturally tend to mimic the behavior of people around you. So if you are calm and you talk in a low voice and a controlled voice, the person is more likely to come down to your level. And I know sometimes that can be hard because you have the same response that you might want to ratchet up to their level. And I actually have, sometimes I'll do this thing where I'll start talking to a person and I will lower my voice subtly. And sometimes, a lot of times that will get the other person to lower their voice as well. Or the other fun advantage is if they have to lean in and listen, then sometimes it breaks their train of thought briefly. So with that, taking your time, that does two things. First, when you talk in a slow and controlled manner, you naturally sound more in control of yourself, while at the same time in the back of your head you could be saying like, this is crazy, this is going off the rails, what the heck? But you sound really calm in the moment because you're giving yourself time. Because how many of you experience where you speed up your talking when you get nervous? Yeah. You give yourself less time and you're probably more likely going to stutter, and then like it just buys yourself time really. So it's a habit to develop. So if you know you're going into a conversation, we're probably naturally going to speed up. Sometimes I get a friend and I tell him to kick me under the table, so that's helped. And be mindful of your body language. So, for example, if you, for me, if I bring somebody into my office and I want to have a serious conversation, if I have it behind the desk, sitting down while they're standing on the other side, it's going to be very different than if we go to the same table and we sit and we face each other. So, like, open body language is tended to receive better versus if you do things like cross your arms or turn away from somebody. So those little things can make a big difference. So again, pay attention. I find contrasting statements to be very useful. I don't want to, in particular if you sense the person's like, I don't want to personally punish your child, I want to help find a solution. And kind of a funny example I have of this is one time I had a dad call me, and he had two children. One didn't get in trouble a whole lot, and the other one, I knew his name very, very well, if you know what I mean. And so there was a time that the girl got in trouble, and so I don't remember what a punishment was assigned, but he called me and he launched into the conversation with, why didn't you suspend her? And he was going, why didn't you punish her harder? And I said, pause. Do you want me to suspend your child? And they're like, well, no. I'm like, okay, let's go back. What is it that you really want here? I want to help your child. I eventually ended up explaining it was a progressive discipline. It was the first time she got in trouble, so she didn't get a severe consequence. Her brother, on the other hand, like I said, I knew him really well. So prime the pump. This is a good strategy for when you're dealing with somebody that shuts down or you maybe sense isn't telling you what's really wrong. And so earlier I mentioned that I had that parent that turned bright red. Thank you. And in the conversation, they were telling me things were fine, things were going fine. And so what I said was, I see that you're turning bright red, and you're telling me you're fine. I don't think you're fine. And then he was like, okay. He was frustrated because he had a pretty smart child, but they wouldn't turn their homework in. We eventually came up with an intervention, which was one of my favorite. We gave him more science homework because he likes science to get his other homework done. So like, as an educator, I call that 2 birds with 1 stone. And it's a strategy to keep the conversation going, because like one mistake that people can run into is that somebody gives you that body language that they're very uncomfortable, and it's tempting to be like, it's a long day, I want to go home. Like, they said they're fine, let's just be done with it. But sometimes that goes back to that first slide, or not the first slide, but that one about trust and purpose. Sometimes that ends up reinforcing to the person that you don't really care. And I got to pick up the pace a little bit, so we'll skip that. So, this is a very important slide in this, and when you have a conversation, you want to create a shared meaning. And so we talked a little bit about starting with the facts. First agree on what you agree on. Because a lot of times you'll agree on 90% of what's going on, and it's the 10% that makes you want to strangle each other. So it's nice to separate those two. I remember one staff meeting where I sent out a survey beforehand about how people felt. And it was really good because one came with this whole spiel, several pages long, about why this program was important. And I said, everybody said it was important. And they were like, oh, okay. So they assumed there would be a disagreement where it didn't exist. Share your story and ask for their story. This can depend on the situation, but like start with, these are the facts, and you can either say, this is how I see this, or you can start with them. Can you explain to me how you see this? So one example I used of this was there was a situation where there was a a staff member who was sending students to the counselor that had an issue with the principal. The thing that was interesting, that was none of the kids asked to go to the counselor. So I brought the staff member in and I said, okay, this kid went at this time, this kid went at this time, this is what they said. And during the conversation, the person eventually said, are you accusing me of something? I said, no. What I'm doing is like this, these are the facts, you agree that they happened. Can you provide me a rational explanation of why you did it? And then the next day she quit, so I assumed it wasn't a good reason. But it provided them a chance to explain to me, what could have been a reasonable explanation. And sometimes the person will give you that explanation, sometimes you give yours, and that's where testing comes in. You say like, I see this information and we know this and this. Are you perhaps upset because you feel disrespected? Like kind of using that tentative language, asking them, or is this upsetting you because of this? Like, am I interpreting that right? So kind of separating those facts. Paraphrasing is a great strategy, but a special note on that, use your own words when you paraphrase. So if somebody says something to you and you're like, you said that the teacher didn't give you a phone call and that you felt like they didn't give you enough notice. And if you repeat the same thing back to them, two things can happen. Either they could take it as condescending, like you're just parroting back to them, or you use words differently. And there's a member in my family that uses the word table to mean any flat surface in the house. And occasionally we get a little bit confused because I think table means table. We'll be like, I can't find the thing. It's on the table. Oh, it was on the counter, hence flat surface. So I've learned to be like, do you mean? Because I think this is what you mean. So when you paraphrase in your own words, you're more likely to catch that you mean something differently. And create a path moving forward. So to make sure I get through this. Sometimes we have these conversations and they're really good, and then we leave, and then the same things happen, and then we have the conversation again. So when you get to the end of one of these conversations, always have a little bit of a who, what, where, when. Okay, so we talked about who's going to do the intervention, when are they going to do it. An example I have of this is I was dealing with a patron and they were very upset with the contract we entered into. They felt like it was something they could have provided the school and that they wanted a chance. And so we had this good conversation. They explained to me why they felt like, it took business away from them and stuff like that. And then a couple weeks they called me later or emailed me, I forget what it was, and I got an earful because we were still with the company. And when we had the conversation, I didn't explain to them, it was a contract. I'm tied into it for a few years. We're going to, do a couple of these things to minimize our involvement with them, and then when the contract's up, we'll revisit you and see what your proposal is. But I didn't have that, and so they just assumed that, I told them what they wanted to hear, and then, went and kept doing the thing that I wanted to do. The other great example I have of this is when I was a principal, we did response to intervention, now called multi-tiered systems of support, because in education we like to rename things because we think it makes them new. But basically it's a student intervention system, and I remember starting as a principal and a teacher coming to me and like, can we quit doing this? And I was like, we're really confused because I'm like, we meet, we talk about how to help a kid, like what's bad about that? And their explanation was, we meet weekly and we talk about the same things every week. And I was like, that is a very good point. So I'm going to let you on a little secret of when I was MTSS coordinator. My biggest secret to success was I wrote down what we did, and then I told people what we did, and then we kept doing it. Because when we had those conversations, one of the biggest things that would happen is that it wasn't clear what we were going to do. And when we made it clear that how we were going to move forward based on the conversation, good things happen. Okay, so make sure that I have time for questions or feedback. Like I said, I went over building relationships, watching for warning signs, focus on you, communicate a shared purpose, create a shared meaning. One of the things I kind of skipped over was there's Communication is a two-way street. And in our modern society with text messages and TikToks and stuff, and even like your district newsletter, like your teacher, for example, writing in the planner, giving notes to parents is not the same as communication. And the difference is you need feedback on how it's received. How many of you have been told that like somebody talked to somebody? The biggest example I get as a principal is somebody said, I talked to the teacher about this and nothing changed, and what you found out was that they said something passing in the hallway or they sent an obscure email and that was their conversation. I see some head nodding, so you know what I mean. And yeah, like it's good to do those things like district newsletters and to send email updates and things, but just don't confuse that with like a conversation, with communication. That back and forth is what's going to get you the shared meaning, because you need feedback on if they're picking, as they say, picking up what you're putting down. Any questions, thoughts, complaints? I just want to say I'm very appreciative of being here at MASBO. It's been like slightly over a year since I've been able to present, and that actually means quite a bit to me. And there's a full audience, and there's only a minimal number of people in the far back typing on their computer, so that's pretty good. Okay. Thank you.